call this one clay on a stick. Pretty generic name. So the basic demonstration is this. Somebody comes up and you ask them, try and balance this rod on your finger. And a lot of people can do this for a long period of time. And then you say, okay, now what I'd like you to do is to take some clay and I want you to put it on that rod, and you can choose either the top or the bottom. So you're going to try and balance this rod, and I want you to either put the clay at the bottom or put the clay at the top. And you ask them which scenario will be easier to balance. Okay? That's the short version. Now, with our clay, sometimes what we do is we keep it in here. To recharge our clay, sometimes we'll put some water on it. I don't know if this is a good procedure or not, but if it dries out, sometimes it's pretty hard to use. So this should be done for you, but if you put a little water on it and wrap it up and let it rehydrate, sometimes that seems to work. Now, that said, you should have some clay there ready to go. So you make a groove in this thing and you put that on there. Somehow, you get that clay onto the stick. And kids will get to choose where to put the clay, so that's kind of fun. You can let them do whatever they want. And by starting with a choice at the top or the bottom, I think that's pretty good. Now, some of them will say, what about the middle? And you can say, well, let's try that next. But so you put this at the top or the bottom, you say, okay, try to balance it and see if you're right. And when you try and balance this at the bottom, okay, they try that out, then you flip it and try and balance it at the top, and you'll notice that it's a lot easier to balance when the mass is at the top. And some people get this right away, they have no trouble with it. Some people get a little confused by it. Usually people are a little bit confused because when you think about an object tipping over, you think about a tall, skinny object like this, it's very easy to tip it over. Whereas an object like this, I can keep raising this up, it's going to start sliding before it tips over. So we think that objects with a lot of the mass towards the base are not going to tip over. And that's true because whenever an object tips over like this, if I can raise this slowly, right now the center, when you talk about an object tipping, you want to think about a pivot point. So in this case, when this object tips, this spot right here is the pivot point. And right at the moment that it tips over, right here, right about there is where it's starting to tip. Right now, the center of mass has not yet gone beyond this pivot point. But as soon as that gravitational force has a line of action which is beyond this pivot point, it causes it to tip over like that. Now, you don't have to go into all that with kids, that's fine. But in this case, the way I like to think about the clay on a stick is I like to think about the moment of inertia wands. So usually we have the moment of inertia wand somewhere nearby when the clay on the stick is going on. So you might also watch that video, the moment of inertia wands. Okay, but in this case, we see that this object has a very large moment of inertia. Right now, the pivot point is right here at my finger. That's where it's going to start tipping over. So it has a very large moment of inertia, whereas right now, this has a much smaller moment of inertia because the mass is close to the pivot point. So when the mass is close to the pivot point, we say it has a small rotational mass or a small moment of inertia. In this case, it has a large moment of inertia or a large rotational mass. Now, we know it's more likely to be unstable up here, but because it has a large moment of inertia, it takes longer to rotate. So when something has a large mass, it's hard to accelerate or hard to decelerate, right? If something has a large mass, like a train, it's hard to get it moving. It's also hard to stop it. In this case, we have an object with a large rotational mass. It's hard to get it rotating. So your mind has enough time to make adjustments and fix this. So you can see it's actually very stable, right? You can move this around and you can do pretty much anything you like. If you try that with the mass on the bottom, it's a lot tougher. Okay, so try and shake it around. You can do it, but it's definitely a little bit tougher. So, and that's because of the smaller rotational mass, it starts rotating more rapidly, so your brain has to make more adjustments more rapidly. Okay? So there's a difference between stability, whether something tips over, and this demonstration. And that's the thing that we're trying to puzzle people with and make them think about. So if you want, you can talk about objects tipping over, or you can completely ignore that. You could talk about moment of inertia and discuss the moment of inertia wands if you'd like. But again, that's the supposed counterintuitive part of this. So this was clay on a stick.